One. Welcome back. I'm Alfred Lambremont Webre, and it gives me the great privilege to be here today with our fellow Vancouverite and fellow researcher and contactee, I must say, in the extraterrestrial field, Terry Tibando. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Alfred, and thank you for having me on your show again.
Oh, sure. And those of you who have seen part one of this two-part interview may recall that Terry Tibando is an author, researcher, and experiencer, and has written and has published volume 1 so far of, listen to this, a 6-book masterwork entitled A Citizen's Disclosure on UFOs and ETI, Extraterrestrial Intelligence, Global Evidence of the UFO and ETI Presence, Volume 1. And in Global Evidence of the UFO and ETI Presence is the first book in a series of 6 volumes that was originally written as a single 3,500-page treatise entitled A Citizen's Disclosure on UFOs and ETI. And they're intended together to be a comprehensive and definitive series of books offering those who are coming into the field a clear path for further research, and also offering the seasoned ETI UFO investigator alternative insights. So picking up then on where we left off on part 1, and we'll have the link to the part 1 interview both in the program description to this video and in the article that accompanies this. You had covered a whole series of topics, including the holographic universe. But where would you like to start off? Maybe with an overview of what you covered and what you're going to cover.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Alfred. Yeah, we can recap very, very quickly some of the things we talked about last time, and I won't really get back into the same in-depth lecturing on these subjects, but essentially we were looking at the UFO and ETI phenomena from antiquity to the modern times. And it covers a lot of different countries and some of their interactions with ancient astronauts or ancient ETs that may have interacted with their cultures. And then we progress through that into the actual relics and stuff that were found, artifacts from places like Kiev in Japan, Mexico, ancient Sumeria, Mesopotamia, the elongated skulls of South America and the Central America, all of those kinds of things. In other words, what we're trying to show in some of those first chapters in the book was that there has been evidence, whether written or traditional, or whether it was sculpted or fashioned, to indicate that they had this interaction with what they would sometimes refer to as the star nations. And these would be the visitors from other planets or other solar systems. And as we went through all of that, we talked about some of the mythologies that surrounded some of these cultures, both Sumerian, Greek, Norse, Dagon, Drupa, East Indian mythologies, all indicating their interactions with the ETs at that time. And as we went through that, we then touched on aspects of religious facts and myths surrounding the UFO phenomena, because when you start to delve into a lot of holy text, you find that there really isn't a lot stated on this subject. It is more or less stated in a manner that requires interpretation of a verse or of a paragraph or chapter or whatever. And we're using modern day thinking to understand that. And that's not to say that what's written in those books was perhaps written in some form of symbology, some metaphor for something greater. What we did find is that the East Indian culture, the Hindu culture, seems to indicate evidence or at least oral written tradition of craft that flew, including the manufacture of these craft. And we looked at things from the Bible regarding what exactly was the verse of Ezekiel, or the chapter of Ezekiel describing, when he described a wheel within a wheel, and beings with 4 sets of wings and 4 heads, and everywhere they moved, they turned, and all the rest of it. And we then looked at what the Baha'i faith said, which is very specific about this whole topic. And this is rather unique in the annals of religion, because even though, say, if we look at the Quran, it mentions that there's life on other worlds, but it breaks it down into men, angels, demons, and jinn. And of course, jinn could be a plethora of all kinds of entities and creatures. So it indicates that there's something more than just what's on this planet. The Baha'i faith delves into that a little more and says that, yes, there is life on almost all planets that have a star that is fixed or stable. So if, say, that star is in and it's a prototype of evolving, and it's got all kinds of gases and objects flying around it, which will eventually become the beginnings of a protoplanet. And then as the planets evolve, you know, life and everything else, and chemicals, etc., that form the life happens. Well, you find that all of a sudden, Baha'u'llah would say that know thou that for every fixed star there is, it has its planets, and every planet has its creatures, which no man can compute. So what he's saying is the universe is filled with life. It's not an empty space with planets and we're the only life form. And NASA recently said when they discovered Pluto, not discovered it, but photographed Pluto, that they have considered that there might actually be some form of water underneath all that ice that's on parts of Pluto. They've described mountains of ice and great oceans of ice, but there are cracks in the ice, which means there's some kind of venting taking place in the core of the planet. And they're seeing some strange objects on the surface of the ice, which looks like giant snails. And now this is wild speculation. They've sort of acknowledged that, you know, this is probably not what it is. It's probably an upwelling of material that hasn't yet sort of gone back under the surface. But it's very odd that when you magnify these dark blobs, they do look kind of snail or sluggish like. So you're scratching your head. But they've said now we may have to consider moving the zone of habitability further out into the solar system. They once thought that it was between Mercury and Mars, and that was the best place for life to develop. Mars being a bit too close to the sun, so it's not likely. Venus has got a runaway greenhouse effect on it. Its temperatures are incredibly hot, into the hundreds, up to about 600 or 800 degrees. So technically, human life could not exist on it, which leaves the Earth, which we know about, and it leaves Mars, which seems to have, perhaps in its past, oceans and may have even had life on it at one time. This is yet to be confirmed. And then they've looked at some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and such moons as Ganymede and Enceladus, and these are further and further out. But they're saying we photographed the surfaces of some of these moons, and we can see jets of salt water coming from them, and these geysers of spray are literally hundreds of miles up. And they actually flew the Cassini probe before it was sent plunging into the atmosphere of Saturn, in through these geysers. And that's what they found, was salt water. So they're very excited by this, because that's one of the ingredients for life. So what we're saying is that life is, the zone of habitability, or the Goldilocks zone, has expanded dramatically. And this is only reconfirming what Baha'u'llah said in the middle of the 1800s. So the thing is, you're getting scientific proof for a religious divine understanding. And so that was what we discussed in the chapter on UFOs and religion. And then we were looking at things of how do you make yourself a better observer? How do you know what you're seeing when you're seeing things flying in the sky? Is it during the daytime? Is it at night? If it's at night, is it under unusual circumstances? How do you understand cloud formations and halos that around the sun that sometimes will look like that there's 3 suns in the sky, one on either side, in a sort of a rainbow type arc? So there's that aspect of learning how to identify what I call conventional objects, whether that's meteorological, astronomical, man-made, something that's being generated from the earth, etc. And then we looked at the what I call the phenomenological reality of UFOs and ETI, and that's just basically saying that there's some physical evidence for their presence, what they leave behind if they land upon the earth. The aspects of physical, it could be crushed grass, it could be a scorching of the earth, it could be broken trees that are in a sort of a circle, this kind of thing. The psychological effects of seeing something that you don't understand, or maybe you suspect of what you think it may be, and then you're wondering, okay, if this is an actual object that flies, is it one of ours? Is it man-made, or is it from another planet? And who's on board, sort of thing. And we've had examples of Travis Walton's incident down in Arizona, Steve Michalak up in Falcon Lake in Manitoba, the Cash Lumdrum incident where they saw a large diamond-shaped craft come over, followed by a number of helicopters. So all of this is in the UFO literature. It's easily accessible when you go online, if you have a computer, and you can pull this information up. One of the things I should say about my book is I believe there's nothing quite like it out there on the book shelves and bookstores. The reason why I say that is there's a lot of books that come out year after year, and sometimes you may see 20 new titles on a bookshelf store. And when you open up the books, you get a lot of great information that's in there. Very little in the way of photographs if they're trying to explain something. The difference with my book is it's full of photographs. There are literally hundreds of colored photographs to explain a particular sighting or what somebody recorded or reported. And the interesting thing about all of that is that it becomes a reference manual. So if you have a particular knowledge about a certain sighting, there's a good chance I may have recorded that sighting. I don't pretend to record every single sighting that's out there because it literally numbers in the millions. But I try to pick out the best ones that caught the attention of a lot of UFO researchers. And that's what the bulk of the book is about, is these countries that have seen the different craft flying around. In some cases, there would have been ETs on the ground, or perhaps there was an interaction with them in some form or another. And then we looked at some of the psychologists that got involved in the UFO phenomena, such as Carl Jung and Benjamin Simon and Leo Sprinkler and Johnny Mack and Michael Persinger, who all of them had different takes on the phenomena, and they were trying to understand what exactly people were seeing at the time. And so we talked about some of their investigations. And Benjamin Simon was the doctor that hypnotized Barney and Betty Hill to find out more about what they had seen. And Leo Sprinkle was one who actually believed that there were ETs on board these craft and that they were trying to interact deliberately with humans. And so at his time, when he was reporting this or writing about it, there weren't a lot of people jumping on board of it because they were still trying to figure out what exactly was a UFO. Were they extraterrestrial craft, or were they some form of hallucination? Was it a hoax? Was it military? All of these things. And so we're kind of up to date almost where we left off. And one of the things I thought we'd talk about is the categorizing of the UFO phenomena.
Right. Those are the different categories of close encounter of the different kinds. Yeah. Do you want to start with those?
Well,
go into them.
Sure. And here's the thing. And the term UFO came out of the Second World War, and they knew back then what they were dealing with, because they had reports from both Europe and the Pacific, in around Japan and China, of objects following and even looping around the aircraft that they were flying in. And they referred to them as Foo Fighters. And when the war was nearly at a close, they asked the Germans, "Are they theirs?" And they said, "We don't know what they are. We've never seen them before," you know. And they were just as mystified. So one then has to consider, well, what exactly were they dealing with? And Churchill and Dwight D. Eisenhower did meet to actually discuss this phenomenon. And the course of action they decided was to keep it secret, but to develop what do they call it? An interplanetary phenomena unit, I think it was called, something like that, where they would investigate these strange objects and not reveal it to the public. In fact, when the war ended and just before we got into the 50s, they came out with the term unidentified flying object, which covered a multitude of different things and a multitude of sins, basically, because it kept the inquiring public busy trying to figure out what it was. even though the military knew what it was, which was extraterrestrial. They actually had a sighting that came over Los Angeles during the war, and they shot something like 1,400 rounds of artillery at this object, and they even believe they brought it down. I don't know the particulars of whether or not they were successful at that. There was the case back in 41, I think, that predated that, of the famous Dorado sighting, where a craft did come down and there was a being or beings on board, and the military called out a reverend or a pastor to come out and give the final benediction or rites to the deceased corpse. So and that was a case that took a long time to come out, but even before the war was over, they knew at that point they were dealing with something that wasn't from this planet. So when you jump ahead today and you hear of what's going on with the Navy chasing Tic Tacs in the sky and referring to them as unidentified aerial phenomena, to me, this is just a new term designed for this generation that is out there who may be interested in this, but still keeping a careful control of the spin on it. In other words, as much as UFOs were a mystery to our generation, and when I say that, we're looking at, I'm now 71, and so we're looking at a generation of every 20 years. So at least 3 generations knew about UFOs. All of a sudden now they're called UAP. And that to me is just more of the same nonsense that they are trying to pull over our eyes. And because a UAP is an extraterrestrial vehicle. So to pretend that it's anything else is silly. And you have to understand that there has been a program in the 50s of shooting down these objects if they did not respond accordingly to our air territory, our sky parameters of identify themselves. And why should they? Because first of all, we're assuming that if they are indeed extraterrestrial, do they even know our language? So they would shoot at them, and sometimes they get lucky and they bring them down, and then what they're able to do is to retrieve the craft and the bodies. And so when you understand that they're so curious about how these things are flying, how they're getting here, who's piloting them, you understand that they're after the technology. And this is a reason why they're not coming out with a transparent disclosure on this whole phenomenon. If they did that, then they're tipping their hands to other nations. So they don't want the other nations to know what they're doing, even though most military nations understand what the US is up to, because they're doing the same thing. So it comes down to another form of brinkmanship, of trying to see who can outdo the other nation and keep that secret and employ it in their own arsenal.
Right. And who are the parties? Could you describe who the various parties are? Because we have the bulk of humanity that I think in our hearts we want to know, and then there's between humanity and, let's say, various extraterrestrial civilizations, there's the controllers, and the controllers are not a monolith, but there must be various parties. And then there's the extraterrestrial civilizations. is there any way of identifying who are the civilizations and who are the controllers, you know, in kind of a rough way?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's, I think, one of the biggest mysteries in this whole phenomena is who's controlling the information. Well, I would have to say that the military, obviously, because they employ weapons and the manpower to go out and cordon off an area and prevent other people from getting in, they're one of the people that are controlling this. Now, you also have to understand that the military gets its weapons from private industry. That means that there are people within the private industry who are, they're essentially what we used to call the warmongers, who essentially created a situation of antagonism between a couple of nations, and then went in and sold the weapons, and they were always making money at it. So it's being said that wealthy families under the name of Rothschild, Bilderbergers, and some of the other names escape me, but they knew that given, like they said, give me a war, we don't care who wins, we'll always make money at it. And I'm thinking, my God, there are people out there who really don't have our best interest at heart, and they call themselves human. You know, they're a part of the human race. The rest of us, who are the munchkin, the sheeple, are running around trying to figure out what's going on, who's controlling the curtains on the stage. And it's like when you get behind the stage or pull back the curtains, like in The Wizard of Oz, that Dorothy sees that there's a man there, and he's speaking on a microphone. He's telling them not to look, and he's busy moving the levers and all the rest of it. Well, that's, I think, an analogy to what's going on today, that you've got the wealthy corporate elite providing the military with its weapons, and then you've got the intelligence community, who obviously wants in on all of this and has developed its various forms of intelligence in different levels. You know, we used to think of intelligence as the FBI, and then, and particularly in America, and then it was the CIA, and then it became the NSA, and then this other shady group called the NRO, National Reconnaissance Organization, who say they own the night. You know, it's all very, very scary, because there's different levels of secrecy amongst them. And even people within that organization who work for those organizations don't know what's going on. It's probably, in the scheme of things, only a handful of people know exactly everything about this phenomenon. The rest of us are the UFO researchers, or the people that work for the government in either politics or intelligence or military, that have a handle on the situation. So that's the way you're looking at it. And if you believe some of the stories that have come out, where the military in the US have actually had some form of formal agreement with one or two visiting extraterrestrial intelligences, then they are helping them to develop these reversed engineered vehicles, these alien reproduction vehicles. And we know that the Germans during the war had these same vehicles, or at least had help to develop these Wunderwaffen, the wonderful weapons of destruction. And when they were asked, how is it possible that you got so far ahead in your technology, they said, we had help. And they would say, where did you have your help? From them, pointing upward. And what they were referring to is they had help from extraterrestrials, because they had a craft that came down back in the late 30s, in the Black Woods that they covered and they retrieved, and the beings were still alive, and it formed some of the bases of their sort of cultish background, the Black Sun and the Vril, and how these beings came from, I'm trying to think of the star system.
Betelgeuse?
Pardon me?
Betelgeuse?
Some like in Orion,
Aldebaran?
but I'm just trying to think. It's again, it just eludes me. But the fact is that they did build these craft, and they were flying saucers, and they had maneuverability and power that conventional aircraft at the time did not have.
Right.
Rockets were only one aspect of their development, which and this is interesting because it starts to shine a light on why there was a rush by the various Allied nations to get into Germany and to get to these secret underground laboratories and to get hold of the scientists. And very fortunately, the US and Britain and some of the other Allied nations got in there before Russia did. But Russia still grabbed a great many German scientists, all of who were Nazis, even the ones that America's had. And so Operation Paperclip was the bringing of 1,500 Nazi scientists back to the States in the Southwest, which is where they developed the V-2 rocket into something that was more usable, but other than a weapon. And Warner von Braun was a part of that, Hermann Oberth, and a number of other scientists. And the interesting thing about that is they were also aware that there was another program going on, which was the development of the Glock and other flying vehicles. I mean, one of the interesting, there's been a lot of pictures of the Vril type flying saucers, the Haunebu flying saucers. Some of these were huge, 150 feet in diameter, and carrying a number of people who were either operating the craft or were soldiers that they could let off. And they even had cannon and gun placements in around the craft. So they were designed to shoot almost in any direction, including below and above. So, and then recently, when I say recently, in the last year or two, Dr. Greer had his film documentary, Unacknowledged. And here was a video of a flying saucer, a Haunebu, that was flying over the tarmac. And this is the first time I've ever seen this. This was like a confirmation of what everybody knew, but they hadn't seen the actual flight test. And here was a flight test of this craft. Admittedly, it isn't the best video. It's rather blurry in a couple of spots, but and I know that I was trying to make out the insignia on the craft, which looked like it was the German Iron Cross, but it's hard to tell. But the fact is that with retrieval of alien craft that had been either shot down or gone through some accident, the militaries of the world, particularly the States and Russia and probably China and in South Africa, have all been looking at ways of developing the technology and marrying it in with their own technology. So this is the whole aspect of the close encounters. And now what we're looking at is, when we talk about the close encounters, there's the close encounters of the first, the second, and the third kind, which we're all fairly familiar with. Steven Spielberg came out with the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It could have been called the fourth kind because they had an interaction with ETs. And One would even say that it was a close encounter of the fifth kind. The fourth kind is usually considered an abduction or injury to a human observer. And the ETs are in control of the situation. And so the abduction is something that has been labeled probably incorrectly to the terminology, the fourth kind. But because people are so used to it now that it's pretty much stuck. When we look at close encounters of the fifth kind, we're looking at a new terminology or a new classification developed by Dr. Stephen Greer, which is, this is a human-controlled contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. And basically humans go out into a field somewhere and using various methods of communication modality, vector in a craft to their location, and in doing so hope to engage the pilots, the extraterrestrials, in a peaceful setting, in a hopefully a communicative dialogue of some kind. And that's what a close encounter, or CE5, is is labeled as. That it's that type of encounter. Now, I've also come across other encounters that have been brought forth by other people, and one of them was Ted Blocher, who I think is also a very well-known, respected scientist. And basically, he said that there's also classifications for this as well. He talks about, let's see, he's talking about, if I can find it, that there's different, it's similar to what Jacques Vallée came up with, which is anomalies and flybys and the way ET craft maneuver and the way that they engage the human observer. And so he came up with a classification, and it didn't really take off. I think that it was published as the UFO wave of 1947 by Nightcap in 1967. And essentially it was, he labeled it as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and A was an entity observed only inside a UFO, B is an entity observed inside or outside a UFO, C is an entity observed near a UFO but not going in and out, D is an entity observed, no UFO is seen by the observer, but the UFO activity has been reported in the area at about the same time. And then E is an entity observed, but no UFO is seen, and no UFO activity has been reported at the time. F is an entity of a UFO of no entity or UFO observed, but the subject experiences some kind of intelligent communication. In other words, he's hearing voices of some kind. And then G is the abduction phenomena, which is associated with the close encounters of the fourth kind. There is also a Canadian who came out with a classification, 12 types of close encounter classifications. And he's only really sort of got involved with this up to the level of about close encounter of the seventh kind. And I'll just quickly go through those as well. I won't be specific as to what each one represents, but I think they're obvious. The first one, class 1 encounter, is a visual sighting. Class 2 is craft identification. Class 3 encounter is a craft description. Class 4, occupant identification. Class 5 is the extraterrestrial life form description. Class 6 is the alien visitation, and Class 7 encounter is a witness entanglement, which involves some kind of interaction with the ET. The other ones that he describes is as Class 8 is an entrapment, enticement, or abduction. Class 9, the communication experience. Class 10 is the offering of proof. Class 11, the gift of opportunity, and which could be some kind of knowledge base. And then Class 12 is a civilization exchange. So he's really gone into that. And when I read through that the first time, it got me thinking about going back to the traditional J. Allen Hynek classification of close encounters of the first to the third kind, and then Jacques Vallée's expounding on that, and Dr. Greer's close encounters of the fifth kind. I've come out with two others which are provable. And that's the basis of anything like this, is that if you're going to come out with a classification, you have to be able to say this is provable. And close encounters of the sixth kind is at this time in our history a rare event occurring to a few select people who are most likely to be astronauts, cosmonauts, or the Chinese equivalent of a cosmonaut. And it is usually an encounter that is made, that is either encountered or deliberate, with contact with an extraterrestrial spacecraft or extraterrestrial intelligence while out in space. That's why it's so unique. So you have to be pretty much an astronaut to experience this. And this means that the encounter will be either identifying a craft in orbit, on the moon, or on some other distant planet in our solar system or other star system. So there is room here for the growth of that type of close encounters. And most of the astronauts from the Mercury missions have seen these objects. Every time they've gone up, these objects have been in there, orbiting the Earth, and actually approaching fairly close to their own spacecraft. And so that's from the Mercury astronauts, which were Shepard, Glenn, Carpenter, Grissom, and then you get the Gemini astronauts, Schirra, Borman, Conrad, Lovell, Stanford, and Apollo astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins, Conrad, Cernan, Mitchell, Leary, Musgrave, on and on and on. And all of these astronauts have had this experience, though they don't talk about it until many years later when they've left the program. The other close encounters that I've come up with is close encounters of the seventh kind. And this is probably the most enigmatic and the most controversial of the close encounters, because it doesn't occur in the physical plane of existence, but in the plane of the alternate or higher consciousness, something referred to as cosmic or God consciousness. The type of encounter is somewhat rare, infrequent, but more accessible to the general public. And by that I mean that one can have an experience through the practice of meditation, whereby contact can or may be established not only with highly evolved extraterrestrial life forms, but with celestial, astral, divine, etheric beings as well, or even the departed souls. And we see this all the time with people who are into mediums and who are able to channel. But the proof of the is in the pudding, as they say, in the eating of the pudding. And that is, if you have a remote view through the process of meditation, and you see an object or an event unfold, and then the event actually physically unfolds, whether it be within a matter of hours or a following day or a week later, but it unfolds exactly the way you saw, that is a CE7. And I've actually experienced that personally, along with one other person, and we both had the same identical remote view where we saw a craft come down and land on a desert floor, and then it got up and moved a little closer towards our group. And we both had that, and we shared that with the group environment that we were in. And then we were expecting it to happen that very evening, but it didn't. We go back out into the field the next day, and all of a sudden the exact remote view experience unfolds physically, and we're watching with binoculars and night scopes, and we can see this happening. And it isn't just the one craft, but many other craft. And so that's the CE7. And so that's through the act of developing a higher consciousness, usually through meditation, where a physical event unfolds based on the information you received. So that's the close encounter.
Right, right. And just listening to those, that's a very complete and exhaustive list. And just to make a distinction there for people who might, those are the close encounters with the human contactees. That is, it's the humans that have the close encounters of the first through the seventh type, the close encounters of class A through E, class 1 through 12. And because now in the same field, there's other allied phenomena which have taken up a lot of attention, but which are completely different. And I'm just saying this to clarify it for our audience. One is the secret space program, but that has nothing, that is different from these close encounters, because the secret space program are the organized space program going out into contiguous space, into the solar system, and patrolling or servicing bases, etc. And the other is the MILABS program, military abductions, which is, in my view, a war crime, because I'm a war crimes judge. It's a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, because it's intruding upon the civil liberty and the civil rights of innocent people and making them think that they're having a close encounter. Whereas in fact, you have a certain mind control techniques that are being used by a military force for purposes of brainwashing the human population for certain reasons of social control. And I just wanted to bring in those things. Do you cover those things at all, the secret space program or the MILABS programs?
Yeah, I do. And not so much in the first volume, but in the other volumes I do. Now, the interesting thing is that it's hard to get real concrete evidence and proof that the secret space program exists. But a lot of people really do believe it does exist, and there seems to be indications of certain development. Now, if you're looking at reverse engineering alien technology, and if the Germans had been doing it during the Second World War, and now we're America and Britain and Canada and Australia and France and Germany and Russia and probably China, all these countries are probably trying to do the same thing, which means that if you take an alien reproduction vehicle, which is a simulated man-made craft that kind of mimics the performance of an extraterrestrial spacecraft, not completely, but mimics it in a manner of moving, zigzagging, flying up and down, moving quickly across the sky, etc., or even out into space, then yeah, that would have to indicate that there may very well be a secret, black secret space program. Now, interestingly enough, all of us have intuitive feelings and gut reactions to certain news items that we hear, and our mind sometimes runs in overdrive. But I can remember back in the early 70s when they were doing the Apollo moon landings. I used to watch all the space flights from Mercury up through Gemini and Apollo, and then after Apollo, I kind of lost interest, not because it wasn't exciting and what they may have seen on the moon, but I had a feeling at that point, before the program was over, that they had something else flying around and they weren't telling anybody. Now, that's a gut feeling. Did I have the proof? No, I don't. Until maybe more recently, when you start to hear of the black secret space program. I even had, back in the late or mid-90s, a remote view of an object out in Earth orbit that was very unusual in shape. And the best way to describe it is like an old skeleton key, where it had a round portion on one end and a long sort of tube or fuselage in the middle, and a kind of a hook or notch on the back end. And I remember that the feeling of what I was seeing was man-made. It wasn't something that was extraterrestrial. And then I saw photographs by, I think it's John Leonard, I think that's his name, the guy who was taking photographs during the daytime with some kind of high-powered telescope and seeing objects out in space that he thought were part of the Solar Warden program. And that's a term that's also being bandied about. Now, the thing is, I try and tread very carefully when I'm writing my books, because I don't want to get into speculating too wildly, because otherwise your book becomes just nothing more than speculation, and I'm trying to go after the hard facts. And so I need more proof that this is happening, even though people in the UFO community are acknowledging it. No one's come up with the actual proof of these objects that are out there and what exactly they're doing, whether they're going to other planets, leaving the solar system, etc., etc. There is, amongst some of the people within CSETI, who, that's the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, founded by Dr. Stephen Greer, he says that we're not likely to get too far out of the solar system. We might be given the opportunity to go to some of the planets with people, but it's like we're being quarantined and kept in our cage, as it were. In other words, we're still very much immature as a species. We've developed these highly advanced craft and weapons, and we haven't developed the social maturity or the spiritual maturity to go along with it. Because if we're firing at these objects and trying to down them just to get hold of the technology, we represent a possible threat to the rest of not only life in this solar system, but life in other star systems, because it's like the monkeys have found the matches to the fireworks and they're having a great old time with it. And so if we have the ability to leave the planet and start traveling to other planets, and then eventually probably leave our solar system, we'll be knocking on somebody's door in another star system and saying, hey, you remember us? You know, we're that third planet from the sun and in the solar system, and we like the looks of your planet. Can we come and stay? You know, I mean, this kind of thinking, whether or not that would happen, I don't know. But we have an understanding that the Earth is being quarantined, and that extraterrestrials come here knowing that they take their life in their hands if they land on this planet, because we're not necessarily showing them hospitality, but rather aggression. And when you're firing, not only throwing rocks and stones and sticks and stuff, and then you start shooting at them with guns and what have you, or you start firing missiles, which is what the military is doing, that doesn't bode well for a friendly planet. And yet, ETs, being of such high intelligence, recognize that we're at a tipping point in our evolution where we can evolve towards a global civilization living in peace and harmony with each other, but also with our neighbors from the other planets and other star systems. But we haven't yet reached that. We actually have institutions and organizations with some marvelous plans and programs in place. But the problem is you have to educate the rest of humanity as to what they are. And they have to be able to recognize the truth of what's in your program or your agenda, whatever, that it is a benefit not only to people in, say, your city, but it's a benefit to the nation, it's a benefit to the whole planet. And so ETs are watching us to see what we are doing, and they monitor everything that we do, whether that's building a dam or constructing a military base or whatever. They're going to be watching us. I mean, I've seen them locally where they fly down Coquitlam River, and I know they're monitoring the water intake from from the dam that's up along Pipeline Road. And there being reports of sightings along that river. In one case back in the 60s, I think it was, one craft actually landed and a bunch of kids saw it land right on the riverbed. And so they're testing the water to see how pure it is, and whether, because between the source of the water, which comes from a lake, and this is one of the purest waters that we have for the lower mainland. And there are a number of sand quarries and rock quarries along the way, and they're using the river to dump their effluent in. So when they go to that area where they're pumping the water out of the lake and into various pipes to send it down to the rest of Coquitlam, the lower mainland, they're also stopping along the way to check the water to see what's happening after it gets past those rock and sand quarries. And I'll tell you something, Alfred, I've had groups of people up there where we've gone out to do a CE5, a close encounters, and we've had ET interaction in an area out there where they engage with us. So the thing is, that indicates that, yeah, they're not only interested in us, and us definitely are interested in them, but they're also checking out other things along the way. So that's one of the things that we have to be aware of, is that if they were going to be hostile towards us, very aggressive, where they're essentially having an Independence Day type scenario where they're launching all their ships at us and trying to destroy our cities and all the rest, it would have been game, set, match hundreds of thousands of years ago, because we were still fairly primitive, and our best weapons were stone knives and sheepskins for clothing and that kind of thing. And even when we evolved up into the Middle Ages, we hadn't really progressed that far. So the thing is that today, for them to suddenly choose a fight with humanity makes no sense, because now humanity has gotten atomic weapons, has aircraft of its own, tanks, it's got scalar weapons, and God knows whatever else out there. So this is the situation. So if they were here to do us in, it would have already happened. The fact that we're still breathing the free air of Earth is a testimony to their control and restraint.
Yeah, I'm very glad that you mentioned the whole issue of nuclear weapons, because there's good evidence that it was humanity's use of nuclear weapons that really drew the attention of sort of the monitoring of civilizations on us. And the reason for that, I think, and I just want to follow this through, and I think you'll find it of interest because it involves the Disclosure Project, is interdimensional. Because we live in as you know, an interdimensional ecology. And we may be in the third density, but just in various densities or dimensions over, there are complex interdimensional cities just in the next dimension over. And we've had feedback from other civilizations that nuclear explosions in this dimension can actually destroy their cities in the next dimension over and do harm to their cities.
That's correct.
You know, we have been made the destroyer of worlds. That was one of you know, the statements that came out of the Manhattan Project.
Right.
And so that is one of the key concerns of the extraterrestrial civilizations that are monitoring us. And if I can just briefly give this one anecdote that I think you'll appreciate. When, as part of the Disclosure Project, because I was a Disclosure Project witness, as part of my being part of the Carter White House extraterrestrial program, extraterrestrial monitoring program, I went down to give my testimony and be videotaped along with another Disclosure Project witness in California, in Sacramento, who was videotaped, and his job was he rode in the airplanes, which on a periodic basis picked up the nuclear warheads from US bases around the world and drove them and flew them back to the nuclear weapons factories to be recycled. And he said that routinely in his testimony, and you can go to the Disclosure Project video files and view this, routinely these planes, which were filled with nuclear warheads being brought from these bases, were shadowed by extraterrestrial craft, which shadowed them, showing that, hey, we're concerned with these nuclear weapons because they could destroy our civilization, which is in the next dimension over. And under the law of non-interference, this is about as close as we're going to get now.
Yeah.
And you know that we've had, in fact, at these conferences, we've had U.S. Air Force veterans who have testified that UFOs have come in and shut down U.S. ICBM bases just to give that signal that don't you dare set off a nuclear war. Then, in fact, the extraterrestrials in adjacent dimensions will not allow that to occur because it will spoil it will destroy their civilizations.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, well, you know, you brought up a lot of great points, and the fact is that I think maybe, hopefully, there's a few scientists out there that understand what is going on when you blow up an atomic bomb. It isn't just the physical detonation, and you know, you're able to film it and say, wow, you know, and here comes the shock wave, and all the houses and trees fall over and all the rest of it. There's more to it than that. It's going through other frequencies and dimensions, as you pointed out. And so it's like all the planets have a certain frequency and tonal vibrations to them, and they can resonate through not only the physical space, but all these other dimensions. And so when you do something on a planet like blow up an atomic bomb, that signal goes right through the whole multiverse. And so, yeah, they're very concerned because it's going to have an effect upon them, whether they've got cities or whether it's just them physically floating around, whatever. The fact is it has an impact, and you cannot allow that kind of scenario to unfold, because, you know, I believe that as some researchers are thinking, that we once had an interplanetary war within our own solar system. And I think that some of the devastation that we observe on some of the planets may be a result of that, even the asteroid belt. I mean, there's a number of possible scenarios. One is there's an interplanetary war, which I hope wasn't the case, but you know, it has to be considered. And then you're looking at cases of an incoming inbound comet or asteroid that pommels a planet and blows it up. Or their scientists were trying to tap into their core of their planet to extract more energy and somehow set off a chain reaction that blew it up. So we don't know. There's a number of scenarios, all of which are viable. But the interesting thing that you mentioned is that aspect of it, and the fact that we have to be very careful in what we're doing. We can't just assume that we have all this knowledge and that's like, you know, we've got it all under control. We just don't understand it. I mean, we don't even understand the concepts of interdimensionality. How is it possible that a physical intelligence can develop this technology and slip out of that physical time, that physical reality, and sort of go into another reality? It's like what they refer to as the crossing point of light between being invisible and visible. And when it's invisible, it's moving to whatever location it's going to next. It doesn't mean that the craft can't fly in our space. They certainly do that, but they're also traveling in other ways. And interdimensionality is definitely a factor in that. I think Ben Rich, former director of Skunkworks, knew that, and but they hadn't yet quite figured it out. Sure, you can travel at the speed of light, and maybe some of these alien reproduction vehicles can exceed the speed of light, but light seems to be the physical limitation within the physical universe. Beyond that, of course, there is no limitation, because time and space break down, and therefore one can travel almost instantaneously from planet to star system, or even between galaxies. Obviously, the further the galaxy is away, the more time it's going to take to get there, but it's done incredibly fast. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, we can. It might just take we can just take a second or two to look at a picture of the solar system. Would you like to do that?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me just. It'll just take a second or two,
Sure.
and just to compare this and show you. And let me just do that so you can see here. See, this is what I call the great catastrophe. This is our inner solar system.
Right.
This is Mars, Earth, Venus, and Mercury. And this is the planet Tiamat, which was just on the other side of Mars. And the theory is that there was a nuclear war on Tiamat and on Mars, and it turned Tiamat into the Tiamat, Mars, and Earth, and Venus were all verdant planets, and there was a thriving interplanetary civilization prior to the nuclear, the solar system nuclear war.
Right.
And now, and the aftermath of this has been Tiamat is the asteroid belt. Look at that. I mean, there was a nuclear war between a reptilian and a human forces there. Mars was a verdant planet like Earth, and now it's an obloid pumpkin-shaped planet with no very thin atmosphere and no surface vegetation, and just a bunch of reptilian creatures running around on the surface, and the human civilization on Mars is underneath the surface. Venus, as you said, has a runaway greenhouse effect. It has, in the upper dimensions there, a very advanced civilization. The Venusians are very advanced. We know that from the Venusian contactees, but they live in a civilization that is in the upper dimensions of, you know, would be like in our equivalent of 5D or something like that. So I don't want to get too far away, but I just wanted to, you know, share that kind of view.
I'm actually aware of that. Dr. Tom Van Flanden talked about that, and he talks about the fifth planet, planet V, which in this case would be Tiamat, as you're saying, and he doesn't really sort of go into how it got destroyed, but what he's saying is that when the planet exploded into what is now the asteroid belt, and there is a couple of moons that are almost globe shaped, Sirius and Vesta, and they photographed these with the one of the space probes, and Sirius is very interesting moonlet. I think they were the remnants of Tiamat or Planet 5 or Planet V, and that they then became a part of the asteroid belt. Now, what's interesting is when the planet explodes, it releases iridium, and iridium is within the center of the planet. What's really interesting is that we can find iridium on our planet, and it's at the point of when the dinosaurs died out, which is between 50 and 70 million years ago. And you can see this narrow band, and it's found literally almost all around the world. when you dig down deep enough.
Hmm.
And it's ready. I think it has a radioactive isotope associated with it. But what's interesting is that the debris from that explosion had impacted Mars, which basically sent Mars almost into extinction as a life-giving planet. That it wiped out whatever life forms were on there, at least most of them. And it may have, I mean, we're theorizing a little bit here because
Yeah, sure.
because some people believe that we are the Martians who came to Earth as a part of trying to avoid any further consequences of that catastrophe. The moon was pelted like crazy by the asteroid belt. The Mars was affected, Venus was affected, Mercury was affected. And if you go out towards the outer planets, you go all the way out to, say, Saturn, and you look at Iapetus, and Iapetus is a weird moon of about 960 kilometers across, and it has both light and dark material on it. And the dark material, they believe, is part of the impact from all this debris. And so that's a very fascinating moon in itself. So, you know, you wouldn't expect just the inner planets to be affected, but actually the whole solar system.
Oh, exactly. And then not only that, but you've got the Kuiper belt out here. Let me see if I can go to the next. Look.
Yeah.
Here you've got the main asteroid belt. Here you've got the inner planets here. But look, you've got the asteroid belt. Then you've even got the Trojan asteroids out here.
Yep.
Then if you go back here, you've got the Kuiper belt.
Yep.
Outside here, and they've got huge objects. So it's like we're almost the impact zone. This is the great catastrophe. In a new book that just came out, Aeon by Mark Kimmel, it's the great catastrophe. Yeah. So I didn't want to get too far afield, so I'm going to take this down now so we can get back to what we're talking about here.
No, very interesting.
But yeah, so that really it shows the interdependence. You know, we live in this dimensional ecology, and you mentioned the multiverse, how if humanity here is, you know, threatening each other, we have nuclear proliferation. You have the North Koreans, this little, regime, which supposedly is, it's the Rothschilds behind the North Koreans that are manipulating it for chaos and manipulating their nuclear program in order to create chaos as part of the Zionist, chaos thing. And that threatens the entire multiverse, the dimensional ecology of the multiverse.
Oh, you're right.
And if you go one step further to the omniverse, and the difference of the omniverse is that the omniverse includes the spiritual dimensions, the afterlife, and the intelligent civilization of souls. Well, that you set off a nuclear weapon in the Earth dimension, and it affects the souls in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah, yeah.
It does. It does.
Because it's all density. It's all vibrations, frequencies, and
exactly,
and that sort of thing. And so resonance, and so we this is why we cannot keep thinking in a three-dimensional sense. We've got to start expanding the consciousness beyond our awareness, because our awareness can be just as great without the body. In other words, the progression of the souls is done without the physical being that we walk around in.
Exactly.
And so, It's all about vibration, frequency, and resonance, and the fact that there is no such thing as time, and there is no such thing as space. It's all now.
Yeah.
And which this kind of brings up the other chapter I wanted to get into, which is the extraterrestrial hypothesis versus the other hypothesis. And the extraterrestrial hypothesis, I think, is something we've been discussing literally about throughout my book. But how does that compare with things like the staging hypothesis, or the interdimensional hypothesis, or the psychological hypothesis? All of these things, right? The staging hypothesis was prevalent up until the 1980s, and speculated that extraterrestrials have a stage managed encounters as a deliberate policy to educate humanity. And all of that is well within reason. I mean, we don't have to dismiss it, because it may be part and parcel of something larger, right? We've talked about interdimensionality and how some beings who are physical, when they transition into the interdimensionality, they find that it's such a almost a peaceful existence, because there's no adversity to diseases or aging or all the physical things that are limiting us in this reality. And so they in some ways have already transitioned. I wouldn't say on a permanent level, but boy, they like that altered reality of interdimensionality, because it allows them to do so many other things that they weren't capable of doing. I heard it said by one other UFO researcher locally, and he was being interviewed by someone, I can't remember who it was, and he was talking about underground tunnel systems and alien bases. And I was listening to this, and he was pointing out that you may have heard this, that they found a large cave opening up around the Clearwater area out in the back of the mountains. And it's a great big gaping hole, hundreds of feet across, and it has some ice in it. And what he was speculating that it's an underground base for unidentified flying objects. And then he listed a couple of other places, one on Vancouver Island, and another one north of Kamloops, I think up around Vermont, possibly. But here's the thing: if we have extraterrestrial intelligence coming to our planet, and they're operating in interdimensional technology, they don't need tunnels. They don't need to carve out a hole in the ground and go and park their spacecraft, because they just literally phase through and stay inside of that. And when they want to come out, they just come out. And we've actually had people who have witnessed craft that metamorphosized from what appeared to be an airplane into another object, and then go into a mountain. And they said, we didn't see any opening in the mountain, so how did they get in there, right? Was it an illusion, or was this something real? So the thing is that the concept of having tunnels and underground bases is more human than anything else, because that would accomplish what we would need to do with our physical craft. But if you've got a craft that operates interdimensionally, you don't need it, because you come and go as you please. I've actually seen one craft come near the ground, and then it would split off into 6 other craft. So that means that what they're doing is they dock interdimensionally, one within the other. And then when they come to this physical reality, they split off, and then they operate independently of each other. So, you know, that's the concept of understanding interdimensionality, because it produces some very miraculous events that to the uninitiated wouldn't understand what was going on. And so when I was talking about these hypotheses, you know, we're talking about like advanced human aircraft hypothesis, which is something that touches on the Black Triangle, the TR-3B, the secret space program, all of those kinds of things. And then we're looking at the hostility hypothesis, which is that some ETs have a hostility situation, or that we are hostile group, and therefore we are kept in check and balance to make sure that we don't sort of start leaving the planet and start going all over the place. The hypothesis of travel or parallel world hypothesis, traveling between other worlds that are parallel to our own. Things about sky critters or sky beasts, which is Trevor James Constable's thoughts that some of the ETs or even UFOs in our skies, which can be photographed, are actual living creatures. And that's a real possibility because, you know, there are things that are beyond our sight that we cannot see, things that we would term as invisible. A soul is invisible, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so it is possible that there are creatures and entities of intelligence that are both manifest and hidden, or invisible and visible. And some have the technology to go back and forth. I'm just sort of going through some of these. I'm not going through all of them. There's the tectonic strain and electrostaging hypothesis, which is Dr. Michael Persinger's theory that some of the sightings of UFOs, particularly lights that flash in the sky or even close to the ground, are actually tectonic pressure and strains resulting from earthquakes and piezoelectric fields and electromagnetic radiation. So that's all part of it. The one that I introduced the last time I talked to you was the Human Preservation Program hypothesis, that ETs are coming here, and in some cases people are taken aboard the spacecraft and maybe are experiencing medical procedures, but it isn't what we humans think is going on. They're not trying to make a hybridization of both ET and humans, although that's within their ability, but it's to preserve the human species at a level of both the sperm, the ova, and the DNA, so that it can be restarted again should we wipe ourselves out on this planet. Given sufficient time for the earth to heal, they can bring us back into being again. Probably the next time around, we won't be so aggressive towards each other, but that's one possibility. So being so-called abducted by ETs may actually be a positive thing, and that one should consider the fact is that it may be their DNA or sperm and ova that restarts humanity. You know, is that a bad thing? I don't think so. You know, we're doing it with various plant seeds and vaults that we have in cold storage. So why would it be any different towards animal life or human life, right? So that's what I delved into. And then the other thing I got into was the classification of ETs, and that's a really interesting topic because for the most part, initially, it sort of began with the contactees who saw the ET beings as being human, who are either from Venus or from Jupiter or from some other planet, and they look very much like us, but probably more refined, more beautiful, more handsome, stronger, etc., etc. And then we got into starting to see the short little gray beings, and then along came the reptilians and all the rest of it. So the thing is you know, we have to ask ourselves, what's going on? Are we getting one or two or more? How many are there? And I think it was Clifford Stone, yeah, who said that they had estimated there was about 125 ET species coming to this planet. That means that if you've got that many diverse life forms, they probably are working together. As we have a United Nations, they have some kind of interplanetary or interstellar society or civilization where they work together to go off and explore new planets, to make contact with beings who are ready for contact or to observe them. And it is even conceivable that maybe they're going to initiate life on a planet in the form of DNA, which maybe they've already incubated and brought into full term, and they kind of release them out into the environment. And so that too brings up a lot of other speculation as to, has this been done with humanity, or with even some of the cryptozoology type creatures that we encounter, like the Sasquatch or the some of the things swimming around in some of the lakes or oceans. So I mean, all of that is within the realms of possibility. And then as I move through all of that, I'm looking at the types of reports of different gray ETs who all look very similar. They all seem to have the short, diminutive stature, the grayish white complexion. Most of them seem to have the dark oval black eyes, which may be a lens covering, or it could be their actual eyes. Some of them seem to have eyes very similar to human, but of different color or shade. And I show that in the book. I also point out that what's interesting is how this particular entity is portrayed on a regular basis, almost to the form of being a tool of propaganda, where it is constantly shown on TV, in our movies, on books and magazines, etc., or a documentary of some kind, as if that's the only type of ET that's visiting us. And it's either portrayed as sort of expressionless, or looking rather malevolent, or possibly and rarely looking beneficial looking, as if almost friendly and approachable. And so I think that this particular entity is the one that is being utilized by, just give me a second, Alfred. Sorry. And so it's believed that these beings have been, their DNA has been sampled and used in hybridization to create something similar to themselves, but they're man-made programmable life forms. In other words, they look like ET, but they've actually got some circuitry and chips and stuff in their heads to control them by a computer. And they therefore go out and do the bidding of the military-industrial complex, which means that if we've got reverse engineered alien craft, we now got the beings to fly them. And when they start landing here and there and people are seeing them, they say, oh my God, you know, they're real, you know, and oh, they're taking me on board this ship. Well, what are you to believe if you haven't done the research or you don't know anything about this? That's what you're going to assume, that you're going to assume these are aliens.
Okay, are you building up to the false flag alien invasion here?
Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. And but believe it or not, it's already been going on for a while. It's just very subtle. You have to recall what Germany was doing during the Second World War, and that is they had a ministry of news. They had propaganda, all kinds of different ministers operating on different levels. And what they were doing was socially conditioning their people to accepting certain things and making the Jewish people as the bad guys and who really were less than human. And so in this sense, when someone asked Stephen Greer, who is sort of the go-to man on ET, what he was saying is that the program has already been going on probably since the late 50s and definitely up through the 60s, et cetera, et cetera. But it is more of sort of showing that they're there, that here they are running around. And then some of these abduction scenarios were unfolded, particularly with Barney and Betty Hill. I mean, I've had that experience 8 years prior to Barney and Betty Hill, but I wasn't abducted. So if these little beings came into my room, what were they after? What were they wanting me to know? I have no recollection of their presence other than pulling the sheets over my head and hiding from them. But there was the following day and the days and years after my sort of acceptance for other life in the universe. So where did that come from? It's like a download of information. And one could say, well, you need to have yourself hypnotized to pull this information out to find out what went on. And I was saying, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And then I think, well, wait a minute. My mind's so polluted right now with all this stuff. What truth are they going to get out of me? You know, I would just be telling them whatever they want to hear. So is it the real truth or is it something else? And so the thing is that I've collected photographs and things of what I believe are real ETs. And one of them you may have seen is this one that I think was sent to Whitley Strieber, and it shows this sort of ghostly looking whitish ET. And when you look at this being, you can say, my God, the shadows and the definition, everything is there. You know, how can this be a fake, right? I mean, this thing looks like it's staring back at you, right? And then I seen recently, within the last few years, a video of this little being running around inside of a room, kept as a prisoner, you know. So that's one of the ETs that are out there. A fellow by the name of I believe it's Patrick Huygens, or who's. I'm just trying to make sure I got his name right here. But anyways, he has a book out that's basically, Patrick Hughes on extraterrestrial classification, and he lists a number of different types of extraterrestrials, and he lists them as human, short and gray, short non-gray, giant, non-classic, hairy, mammalian, reptilian, amphibian, insectoid, avian, metallic, fleshy, physical, and apparitional. And some of these are really bizarre entities where he's drawn sketches and whatnot, or somebody's drawn it. And some of these things look like human organs, brains with an eye, or blobs of something. And yet they're able to fly spacecraft. And then you get the typical Ashtar Command looking blonde ETs that probably are cosmic cousin. That they're these humans that are so perfect in appearance and whatnot, and they're very robust and very beautiful to look at. And then you got the smaller diminutive types, and then they got the animalistic, animalian types. And the amphibian types is another one that I've got that apparently was found in what appeared to be a large egg of about 1.5 feet across, bigger than a football, and it hatched, and then a being came out of it. And this being is hard to describe. It looks it's about maybe 3.5 feet tall, has a sort of dark eyes, almost ripped amphibian looking face, and it has feet and hands, but you can't see the toes or the fingers, but you can see the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. Very unusual. Timothy Good talks about that particular one. Then you got the mantis and the reptilian, and you got things that look like robots or cyborgs, and things that are both metal and organic. And then you got things that are like stone or metal, things that are shadow, things that look like almost like a giant ant, but more intelligent looking. So these are all the different types of ETs, and I've got pages of different descriptions and drawings of all of this. And then I finally, excuse me, I'm almost losing my voice here. We're getting into this holographic universe, which you wanted to discuss. And basically, what we're looking at here is that the universe is a giant version of what the microverse is. And it's in some ways fractal. That if you were to look at the atoms and the protons and the electrons, they're like little miniature planets. And yet that's exactly what we see out in space when we observe, the planets or deep space and all the rest of it. And I think that there's a very strong correlation there. And what that also says is that perhaps size does not matter. That though there may be life on planets, who's to say there isn't life on an electron or a proton or a neutron or something, or a quark or quark, because that's all part of this holographic universe. When you use a laser and you photograph, say, a rose onto a plate, you can, that plate, if it's made of plastic, you can cut a little piece of it out, and you still have the rose in the large plate, but now you got the rose in the little plate, and you can take that and cut it some more, and you still have the rose in that little piece, and that can go on at infinitum. So that's the concept of a holograph or a hologram. And the universe is set up in that way. Einstein talked about it. Podolsky and Rosen, which is the Rosen bridge hypothesis of getting one atom to respond at a distance when this other atom, and they seem to be linked, but somehow they're not linked as far as we can tell physically, so something else is going on. So that's part of the holographic paradigm. The David Bohm and Hal Puthoff talked about that, along with the fundamental correctness, which would correlate with the fifth element, the mathematical proof of all aspects of the universe being energetically connected. Hal Puthoff assertion in his work on zero-point energy of all charges in the universe being connected, and that further mass is all, in all likelihood, is just an illusion as well. It's like you take a three-dimensional fish and you put it in a tank. You got two cameras. One camera only sees the fish that swims on its side. The other one shows the fish directly face on. You could even have another one technically from above, and each camera will record something else. And one would say there's 3 fish in the tank when actually there's only 1. And so that's the consequence of the holographic paradigm, in that it's a matter of perception. But what's interesting is the fish that you're observing from the side moves. It seems that the fish that you got the camera pointed at also moves at the same time. So are they connected? Or is there 2 fish in total synchronization with each other? So when you start to understand that, then you understand that no, it's all really one and the same thing. And it's like there's a oneness in the universe on many different levels. And when you look out, if you could somehow step outside of the space that we are here to able to see, you'd see galaxies that all seem to be in one area, and they all seem to be connected with strings of matter between them. And you look at that and you say, my God, that looks like the human neurons, and that they're all firing, you know, and all active and alive. And you got to ask yourself, so what am I looking at? Am I actually looking at a universe of galaxies, or is this something more than that? Is it alive, right? And that's the whole point. The universe is alive, and we're just a piece of that universe, but on a much smaller scale. You go within the human neurons, and the way that it works is that we seem to have these little centers where strands of other neurons are connected to it, and it seems to fire up on the same way. And computers, it turns out, particularly optical computers, when you're looking at nano computers, are also set up in the same way. The internet is set up in the same way. So all of that is the holographic universe. And I've even suggested to people that, you know, we build computers and we put it all onto a square plate. But what's wrong with stacking the components on top of each other, so that when you look into a computer, it's like looking into a little city, you know, because it would all work, and each of the levels would operate in something different, right? The super hologram is that the past, present, and future exists simultaneously. That's the super hologram, and with all the physicalities and the interdimensionalities and all the rest of it, so that the saying that all this is that, or the beginning and the end are one and the same, or the alpha and omega are one and the same. See, now we're starting to touch on the spiritual aspects of this whole holographic paradigm, which is really what it is. And, you know, I talked about the human brain very much the same way. It's like somebody who can have a brain operation, they take out a piece of the brain, doesn't necessarily mean that the person suddenly dies, or that he's no longer conscious and capable of conducting himself in a normal fashion, because this too is part of the hologram, the holographic universe that we live in. And then the holographic sound is the way that we can record sounds, and how we're able to locate different sounds with the ears, and we can distinguish between the two. And that's all connected with the holographic brain and its ability to differentiate between things. And all of this is talked about by Zaccarelli and Prebam, or Prebram and Boehm and Maya and all these scientists. so the holographic paradigm is essentially is a sort of a synergistic view of how things all sort of work together, and is a reflection of something larger or smaller. That's the paradigm. And the interesting thing is that this brings up, when you really start to get into it, the holographic state of being and the rational concept of reincarnation. And I talk about this because reincarnation for some people is highly important to them in their lives, because it gives them balance and hope for their existence. And the reality is that reincarnation, as it is understood currently, without being too unkind about it, is really delusional. And by that I mean that you're suggesting, or people suggest, that they have lived before, and that they may have been a soldier in the Roman army, or Julius Caesar, or Cleopatra, or somebody in the Civil War, or this or that. And the thing about it is, they have such recollection of that past. But there's another way to look at it, and it's like a doctor who essentially, if he's trying to determine that you got a pain in your chest, what's causing it? Is it your heart? Is it a muscle strain? Is it something else that's going on? They have to decide, because the symptoms can all look alike, but there's only one thing that's really happening at that moment, and you have to be able to determine what it is, so that you can save that life or give the right treatment for it. And in the same way with reincarnation, is that there is there's strong evidence that we all astral travel when we sleep. And some of us can do it consciously, some of us do it unconsciously, but we have various recalls. And it is possible for someone who says that I had this reincarnation experience and I was this slave, whatever, that what they have experienced is, in the process of astral traveling, either in their sleep, that they made a contact and association with a departed soul. That soul so impressed upon them their essence, that they come away with an understanding of who that person is. But the mind plays little tricks on us and says, I must have been that person, because it feels like my experience. But in fact, it was somebody else's experience. Well, all of a sudden, then that would tend to explain, how is it possible for somebody to claim they were Cleopatra and somebody else also claimed the same thing? Well, two people can't be Cleopatra. So two people can't be Julius Caesar or Abraham Lincoln or the rest of it. So what's going on? The reality is that the soul has the ability to move beyond its body, because time and space don't exist, and therefore going from one place to another is doable in the astral form, and even learning is doable in the astral form. I think one of the superheroes from the Marvel universe was Doctor Strange, and he was able to read Sanskrit while sleeping. In other words, his astral form got up in the night and was reading the book, and that was how he was able to learn. I've heard this of Stephen Hawking and other scientists, that their best work was done during sleep. So the thing about all of this is that, is there an actual reincarnation? In one sense there is, and that is, if I die and I'm buried, the molecules and atoms of my body break down and go back into the ground. You know, the earth and the worms and bacteria carry it through the ground. Now, let's just assume that there's a great ability of the ground to send that stuff out in all directions, right? And even beyond the graveyard. And a plant, a blade of grass, absorbs some of it, and or a flower grows out of it. It's said that poppies grew where men had died in the First World War. Rather interesting. And that's why the poppy is so sacred, because it is associated with the death of soldiers. Now, so it turns into a blade of grass through absorption and osmosis into the blade of grass, and it becomes several blades of grass. And along comes an animal and eats it. And along comes another animal and eats that animal, or the cow comes along and eats the grass, and we kill the cow and we eat the cow. Has that person who was once me come back again in a reincarnated form, or did my soul move on and my body, chemical and chemistry, just came back into existence, but in a different way? That's reincarnation in that sense. But if you're talking about what makes you, Alfred Webre, what makes me, Terry Tibando, unique, it's not likely that it's going to show up again in the same manner as it does right now.
Yeah, those are very interesting speculations on reincarnation. Dr. Ian Stevenson, are you familiar with Ian Stevenson?
I haven't heard of it before.
He's a Canadian, well, he passed over several years ago. He's a Canadian physician who pioneered the study of reincarnation at the University of Virginia Medical School. And there's a whole center there, and has written many volumes. One of his most famous volumes is called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. And he's introduced a whole social science methodology to it. And there's a lot of different social science. There's also hypnotic regression. There's a lot of rigorous science that has been developed to study the phenomena of reincarnation. I put these in a forthcoming book of mine, Emergence of the Omniverse, which will be out in publication on February 29th, which is a day that happens only once every 4 years. Now, this program, I mean, time has flied, and we're moving up toward the 2-hour mark. So are there things that you had wanted to bring up that you haven't had a chance to bring up in the program now?
Well, basically, just before we leave the holographic universe and paradigm and all that, there's a Baha'i quote that kind of reaffirms all of this, and that is, says, dost thou recognize self only a puny form when within the universe is folded? So this is it boils down to this thing where to know oneself is to know the universe, or to know God. And so when you think of all 7.5 billion of us running around here on this planet, if we were to look within, we would understand why we're here, what we're supposed to do. We would relate to each other in the same manner, because the essence of what I am is really is the essence of all people, and we all have our uniqueness and peculiarities and that sort of thing. And so in that sense, we're all connected. We're all one, just like the entangled two atoms. We're all connected in that sense, and it's just up to us to learn. I guess the other thing is that as a teaser for the other books in volume 2, what I do is I get into discussing when somebody has a UFO report and they disclose it, who's listening, who's actually taking stock of what you're saying. Sometimes we have a sighting and we want to report it. So we used to report it to some of the various UFO organizations in the past, and those would have been like APRO. I used to belong to APRO many years ago. Nightcap, CUFOS, which was J. Allen Hynek's organization, MUFON. People report their sightings to CSETI. But what's interesting is all of these UFO organizations have been taken over or become defunct because they were infiltrated by either people, military intelligence, or from the intelligence of CIA, for instance, where they pulled the group apart, created arguments and haranguing situations where they were finding fault with the leadership or how the money was spent or what direction they were going into. And that's how you pull a group apart. Sometimes you start with 2 people and you get them, you tell them each different information, but it's somewhat similar. And they start to squabble. And all of a sudden a third and a fourth become a part of that situation. And before long, you've got a situation where the group is literally falling apart from the inside out. It's not being affected by people from the outside, though it is affected by people from the outside. It's just that they don't know who it is. And so the people that are listening to the reports aren't necessarily just the UFO researchers and the organizations, but it's really the intelligence community or the military group. You sometimes will have to ask yourself, how is it that I saw a craft that looked like it was coming down to the ground? Maybe it was having some problems, and all of a sudden the military show up. Now, one could say, well, they had radar out and they had planes flying around and all the rest of it, so they were able to track it. But the reality is that Big Brother does have big ears and is listening all the time. And it's no surprise nowadays that, for instance, back in the 70s, they had cameras out in space on satellites that could tell what kind of newspaper you were reading. In fact, they claimed they could read the print off the newspaper from 200 miles away. They have the same ability now to hear what you're saying. And not only from outer space, but from all the kinds of electronics that we have, whether it's in a computer, TV, or some other apparatus, whether it's tapping into your cell phone and all the rest of it, somebody is listening and recording what you're saying. And the thing is that if you're somebody who's a terrorist, and you're plotting something, chances are it doesn't have to reach the public ear before the intelligence community already knows about it, because they've been picking up on it. They have people specialized in listening for certain things, whether it's terrorism, whether it's UFOs, whether it's military build-up in some country or another, whether it's something that's going on that has an interest, say, to the United States. More than likely they're going to be aware of it. And so there really is no secrets nowadays. So that's part of what I get into in book 2. I talk about the professional skeptics and debunkers and the hoaxes and naysayers. And, you know, people like Donald Howard Menzel comes to mind, and Philip Klass and J. Edward Oberg. I've had communications with Oberg. He doesn't allow anything to get by him. And he's not afraid to put you in your place. But Michael Brandt Shermer is another one. There's, I think Neil deGrasse is a potential who's knocking on the doors of wanting to debunk this and that and everything else. And
Who was that?
Neil deGrasse, was it Neil Tyson deGrasse?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's the same with Seth Shostak. In other words, if it doesn't fit their world, their paradigm, they're going to tell you and call you on it. And yet, when you start to investigate thoroughly what they're saying, you realize, first of all, like I know with Seth Shostak, he'll say, we've heard a very strange signal from deep in space, and it seems to be coming on regular intervals, and then it would disappear, and then it would start again. And could this be ET trying to contact us? Well, wait a minute, Seth. You know as well as I do, and your education's probably better than mine, is that nothing that we do in a physical universe can go beyond the speed of light. So if you're going to tell me that you're hearing intelligent signals from light years away, you're telling me that they're operating on the speed of light technology, or are they using something else? In which case, what are you actually listening to? So in that sense, I don't have always the greatest regard for what he says on things like that. I think that he likes to think that if ETs do communicate, he'll be the first one that will know about it, and he'll tell everybody else that this is what's happening. And yet, there are stories that have come out where the editor of Sky and Telescope was at I think it was one of the Oxford planetariums or something, and a signal did come in that was very unusual. But what they determined was it was within either in orbit or within the reach of between planets. In other words, it wasn't that far away. So that would explain how intelligent signals could be received at the speed of light. Otherwise, they have to communicate in some other method beyond the speed of light. And then we're looking at things like UFO investigators. What is a healthy skeptic? You're looking at people like Donald Keyhoe, J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée, Greer, anybody who's done some honest work where they don't readily accept everything that comes across, but they're willing to investigate it further to find out if there's more to it than that. So I call that the healthy skeptic. It's like you have to use critical thinking. And there's a section I've got in the book that's called Adventures in Critical Thinking, because it's really an adventure to go into those realms of thought and decide in a clear-headed, minded, logical way what is reasonable and unreasonable. And this brings up the concepts of do you use Occam's razor, which is the answer that let's see if I can remember it. The answer that seems most obvious and logical is probably the right one, or do you use Arthur Conan Doyle's logic, which is based on Sherlock Holmes, which is the power of deduction? Whatever is left over, no matter how improbable, is probably the right answer. So, that's the juggling that you have to do with the subject. And so I discuss that aspect of it. I talk about the UFO ghetto, or the UFO subcultures, and the UFO religions, and the religions that have sprang up based on possibility that ETs are here to teach us a new way of doing things. Usually when you look at it carefully enough, you find out it's a combination of somebody's inspiration mingled with typically in the Western Hemisphere Christianity. And so you get people like Bo and Peep, or as they were known as, where they had the mass murder of all their people, saying that they were being taken aboard the spacecraft, and the only way to get aboard was to die. You know, I mean, and this is the kind of nonsense that gets out into the public, and there are people who are gullible enough thinking that that's the way to go, and they usually give up all their physical wealth and even their parents and all the rest of it to be a part of it, only to find out that if they stay with it long enough, it all falls apart. And then we look at what are really the contactees, people like George Adamski, Truman Bertram, Howard Menger, Daniel Fry, George Van Tassel, Orfeo Angelucci, Edward Billy Myers. I actually met Daniel Fry. He came to Victoria years and years ago, about 1963. So that was my first contact with a contactee. He had an interesting story, you know. He said he never saw any UFO, any ETs, but he had a flight on board a UFO. It was remotely piloted, he said. So I thought that was rather interesting. His story is a little different from everybody else's, but you know, you got to give them credit. And the fascinating thing about contactees is that they say they receive information from the ET visitors, and usually it's always the world is on the teetering point of nuclear holocaust and war, and there could be great devastation and environmental upheavals, etc. And you know, people back then said, "Oh, this is all nonsense. What are you talking about?" But if you gave the message today, it would be relevant. So now you start to scratch your head and say, geez, you know, they weren't believed back in their days, but now what they have claimed to have been told makes a lot of sense. It's relevant. So now you're wondering, do I dismiss them, or do I still put them in the loony bin with all the other granola and flaky people, right? I mean, Greer could be considered in the same context, but the difference is they'll take anybody out, and you go and stand under the stars, and sure enough, UFOs will show up, and the military will start showing up and chasing them around the skies. And I've seen that happen. So, you know, that's the whole point behind all of this. And then, you know, I get further on and talk about cattle mutilations and how some of this mutilation of cattle is military, and how what possible weapons or craft they're using to do it, and why they may be doing it. And it may be that they're taking the DNA and structure of cows and humans, and possibly even ETs, and making a alien reproduction or a programmable life form. You know, I talk a lot about the advancements in genetics and in cloning. And the interesting thing is, it's a program that's been going on for a couple of thousand years. We do it when we take the best cow and the best bull, and we bring them together to produce something even better. And you know, one of the interesting things is we think of pigs of a certain size. I remember down at the P&E years ago, and I went into the farm section to look at the animals, and there was a 1,400-pound pig in there. It was huge, absolutely massive. Well, somebody's been doing some fancy breeding, right? I mean, it's a real science in that sense, and it is profitable. So you know, the farmers who are into cattle ranching and all the rest of it, this is something they definitely look into. Well, what's to say then that some covert scientist or group has decided that they're going to take two different animals and splice them together in some fashion or form on a DNA level. Well, they've taken sheep and injected them with the gene of a jellyfish, and now they glow in the dark. I've got pictures of that. They've taken a mouse that was known as the Vacanti ear mouse and grew an ear on the mouse, thinking that they could replace human ears by having animals develop them. When they evolve into a person's heart, they'll either use pig or bovine. That's a known fact, or they use a mechanical device. Dolly the sheep was one of the first successful cloning of a large animal, but they've also done it with a rhesus monkey. I have pictures of that rhesus monkey, and that was Tetra, the rhesus monkey. Now, if you could do that with monkeys, what's to say they couldn't do it with humans? And I have pictures showing various animals that have been given these jellyfish DNA to make them bioluminescent. And so you got pigs, you got fish, you got rodents, you got cats. The Cheshire cat, yeah, that exists. The only difference is he doesn't become completely invisible, but you can see his pearly white fangs and his sharp glow-in-the-dark claws. You know, it's all real. So that's another part of this. Well, what I'm leading up to is the fact that if you could do that with those types of animals, what's to stop them from making a extraterrestrial, but it's terrestrially made? And it just goes on and on and on from there. And I talk about the famous alien abduction cases and mind control. I talk about Martin Cannon and MK Ultra and the various implants that they have been doing. And now they want to inject everybody with those right now because they've already got them out there. I talk about some of the people who have written different works on abductions and what have you. And one that really comes to mind is David Jacobs. And he still maintains that there's a secret program going on to replace all humanity with some hybrid, because that's what he's come across. But my thinking is, I wonder if he's done enough homework to realize that humans are capable of creating some of these things. And in which case, then what he's saying suddenly takes a turn on its head. And he has to rethink that.
Well, one of the biggest challenges.
Well, that would be the transhumanist agenda, and the hybrid, i.e., the humans. It's like the humans are used to create the hybrid.
Yeah. I mean, we're living in a really crazy world because half the time you don't know whether you're coming or going, what to believe, what to disbelieve. This is a quagmire that we're walking over, and we have to find the rocky place to put our foot so that we don't go off into the quagmire, right? And I think some people have gone off into the quagmire, and their reputations, I think, have been ruined because of it. And so I take a more pragmatic approach and say, show me some evidence and some proof. I got to be proved. Has to be proved before I'm going to accept it. You either have to come at me with your logic, or you're going to have to show me something that's indisputable, or get me to participate in something so that my own eyes can see it and figure it out for itself. That's how these books are written, because I want people to not just accept every idea under the sun. I don't want them to get too heavily involved in speculation, but to see, look, I don't know enough. It sounds like a wonderful story, but until I can sort of kick the tires, and I had one of my former teammates who passed away said, I want to see a UFO, but I want to go over and kick the tires on it. I said to him, I'd like to see a UFO, but I don't think I need to go over and kick the tires on it, probably because
Right, right. What is the subtitle of Volume 2?
The subtitle of Volume 2 is called UFO Disclosure and Covert Programs of Deception. Now, I'm
UFO disclosure
and covert programs of deception. I played around with these titles until I finally got them where I want them. But
right.
I mean, in this particular book has, it's not as big as the first book. It has about 515 pages, so it's about
Right.
300 pages less.
Well, you know, we're now up to 2 hours and 15 minutes, which on this panel, which is about we're nearing the saturation point of any of your average user. So, what thoughts? I'd like to do two things. One is sort of your summary thoughts that you'd like to leave people with, and then how can people has Volume 2 been published yet? Is it in publication?
No, it's not in publication. I'm actually looking at whether I'm going to go and use the same publisher or whether I'm going to get it self-published by going through, say, Ingram Spark.
Oh, I see.
And because they could probably do it for a hell of a lot cheaper, and then I'm not paying the middleman.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, I have to consider what is the publisher is doing for me.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
I feel
Sure.
like I'm doing most of it. Now, all of the volumes that I've written, they're ready to go to print. The problem is that I have to decide on who I'm going to get involved in this and what it's going to cost me, because it will cost me probably if I stay with the same publisher. Now, just so we can keep our viewer listeners informed, the first volume is available through Amazon, Ingram Spark, Barnes and Noble, Indigo, which would also cover chapters in Coles, but they have to be ordered online, okay? A lot of other American book distributors as well, BAM, Book a Million, or Books a Million, and a few others. That even in Britain, you can get it from their Amazon.uk. They're obviously, you can get it through a lot more book distributors in the U.S. Canada seems to be a bit of a problem, but I did check, and yes, the books can be ordered. The problem is whether or not somebody's going to go to their computer and type in UFO or ETI or whatever in order to order it. They're of a university caliber quality. These are textbooks. They're not your basic pocket novel or book novel type book, because whatever you think you know about UFOs, you can go to these books as a reference, see what I have written, see where the references come from, and you can go to the references as well. So that's the bonus aspect of it. It's a bibliography, webliography, videography, and unfortunately, if I had the money to do all this, I'd make all those hyperlinks active in the book. So all you had to do would actually, the way to do it is you have to copy it and paste it. But I was originally wanting to put out a CD with every book so that you had the book in CD as well as in a book form in front of you. The CD would allow you to go to each of the links. That's what it would do when you put it in your computer.
Yeah. Sure.
But the takeaway from all of this is that if you thinking about buying this book, you're not going to be disappointed. I've had a lot of people who have bought the book and said, "Wow, I wasn't expecting all this information." And it's a 840-page book. It's quite heavy, And basically all the other volumes are written in the same style and format, and so you're getting I think pound for pound and dollar for dollar your money's worth out of this. The thing is trying to make sure I get it out to into the public's hands in bookstores and what have you. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And is there if people want to contact you, can they do that?
Yeah. One of the things they can do is that they can contact me at Terry Tibando, Tibando, first name Terry, all one word, at gmail.com. And they can just sort of say, hey, I heard your program on Alfred Weber's podcast. And the other thing is I have a Facebook site under CSETI Vancouver, CSETI Vancouver. And they can leave some information there. I prefer to text. If they need to reach me by phone, they can try me at my cell number, 604-916-7384. And again, if they phone that, they can either reach me or they can at least text me something using that information, right?
Great. Well, I really want to commend you for having undertaking and for manifesting this 6-volume project, and that you're already 2 volumes into it. And so I look forward to your coming on the show again as the volumes begin to manifest. So keep us posted.
Yep.
as to your progress.
Well, one of the things just before I go is I am working on getting 2 volumes out this time rather than just 1. And if these first 2 volumes come out in the manner I'm hoping they come out in, and the price isn't gonna stiff me, then I could probably get the other remaining 3 volumes out all at once as well. That means that all 6 volumes will be out within a period of a year and a half.
Excellent.
And that would be great, because I know that one of the things I want to do is to get it into universities and libraries. And if I could do that, they may take 1 book, but I think they will say, well, if you've got 6 volumes, we'll take all 6 volumes, right? Which I would be happy with. But I also have to recognize that there's a turnaround period with all of that, and making sure it comes out, and making sure it's advertised or up on the book stores, the websites, and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Exactly.
One of the other things I wanted to ask is, when we're off the air, can I talk to you for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Good. All right.
Okay, good enough. Well, thank you very much then. And I'm sure that people are really going to find this approach of having a central reference point to this material very important, and very functional and of great use. So thank you, Terry, and
Very welcome.
Godspeed to you, and keep up the good work. And we look forward to your books as they continue to appear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the interview.
Good enough.